Okay, so now I am back for the plumed. Well, it's kind of part two, but we're not going to talk about the plumed serpents so much anymore. We're going to talk about Gobekli Tepe being in the area of the Fertile Crescent and possibly the Eden. So we're going to talk about Eden theory and civilization theory, and we're going to talk more about a little bit more about Satan and God, Yahweh type of thing, like we talked about in part one of the plumed serpent slash Gobekli Tepe. So the plumed serpent idea kind of led, or it was bleeding into Gobekli Tepe topic. And some of you guys don't really know, or ladies, some of you people, fine folk, you guys don't know what Gobekli Tepe is. Um, the Gobekli Tepe, as I mentioned in part one, was in the southern part of Turkey, Asia Minor, um, just north of Syria. So we're going to talk about the geological and like how Earth and stuff like that kind of transitioned and formed over the years, and cataclysmic events that have been recorded. And I'm going to take some of those cataclysmic events and geophysical and geological um, research topics and theories from other continents and bring it to a little bit of it to Gobekli Tepe. So Gobekli Tepe was discovered, I believe, back in the 80s, but nobody really had any um, particular interest in it, so they ignored it. But then later on, a German archaeologist who is recently died in the past few years from a heart attack, um, he is the one that essentially discovered, quote unquote, Gobekli Tepe. He's the one that wanted to uh, research more into it when nobody else wanted to, and he really got funding through the I can't. It was a research institute for out of Germany. His name was Klaus Schmidt. Professor Klaus Schmidt was up until recently. I believe all projects have been halted on Gobekli Tepe recently. So remember Klaus Schmidt was a archaeologist of Gobekli Tepe up until recently. He's the one that we're gonna reference a lot, and we're also going to reference a lot of Randall Carlson, who does. He's an independent. He's an amateur geologist, but he's probably got a degree by just him knowing and doing this research out of his own interests. He has such a profound knowledge on geology and geophysics that he has actually dwarfed the intellect and knowledge of people who actually gone to college and got PhDs in this stuff. So he is not a PhD certified individual, but by honorary research and his lifetime commitment to his interest, but not interest, his hobby. Geology was just his hobby. He's an amateur, kind of like I'm an amateur researcher. I don't know. I'm not really an archaeologist because I don't really agree with a lot of methods of archaeology, except for when it comes to like etymology and how things progress, and maybe how like religion progresses along with etymology and stuff like that. So theology and stuff like that, but their technology and how they obtained their technology and their time periods and how it lines up, that's what I don't want to call myself an archaeologist or an amateur archaeologist. If I was going to do archaeo anything or label myself as amateur archaeo anything, it'd be archaeoastronomer. But so Randall Carlson, the geologist, and we have Klaus Schmidt. So Klaus Schmidt, in an interview with Graham Hancock in one of his books, actually Graham Hancock, chapter after chapter, first chapter and section, he kind of talks about visiting the Gobekli Tepe site, and like about a year before Klaus Schmidt's death, and he talks about how old Klaus Schmidt believes that all these enclosures, these circular pits with these pillars, they were filled in one like after each other. So I have two theories on that why they were filled in, and I just kicked you guys with my cord because you're charging. Um, so theory one is he said that there was a deliberate infill of dirt and rock and stuff around these monuments, and each monumental structure, each pit, each enclosure is older than the next. So enclosure C, I believe, from that what we know now is the oldest, and then so but as they go on, it's like you're filling these this dirt and rock around these things in in a ritualistic manner. So some theories were that it was like a necropolis, necro, and or necro, like meaning dead, and opolis, which is like Greek for city or city of the dead. And a lot of ancient civilizations had necropolises, like the Aztecs had necropolis. Teotihuacan was necropolis. Um, but there's only small fragments of human bones with other animal bones with these fills. So it wasn't full human bodies. It was almost like a spiritual, ritualistic type of thing. But why would they rebuild and recarve these stones with new? And my only thing for rebuilding is um, it was a refinement process to calculations for astronomical alignments and phenomena. So as the years went on, they intercalated or they calibrated these calendars. This like kind of like almost like a Stonehenge. Like these were just different, better versions of their Stonehenge. That's thousands of years older than the ones in Avebury and Marlborough's Downs and stuff like that in England. And there's also like the Stonehenge of Spain. Um, that's and then there's Woodhenges and stuff like that. But I just kind of got off topic, didn't I? Oh yeah, so Gobekli Tepe. So also Randall Carlson. This is where he comes in. He does a lot of research in Washington, well, North America, but primary focus is like the Pacific Northwest, the like Montana, uh, Columbia Basin of Idaho. Well, Idaho is not Columbia Basin. Idaho, if I know, does not have is not a part of the Columbian Basin. The Columbian Basin is actually in central Washington and parts of Oregon, I believe, but and then Canada. And he talks about the Laurentide and uh, ice sheet and the Cordilleran ice sheet. I believe I pronounced that right. And how possibly right around that time, the Great Flood and all these myths and stuff like that, there's evidence that there was a comet or impact. It's called the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis. Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, where those ice sheets in North America had a rapid melting due to a comet impact. Oh, that broke up and crossed the northern hemisphere, and most of it hit. A large portion of it hit Greenland, and then the other large portion of it, or two large portions of it, hit in Canada, North America, and that had a great flooding effect, like a wall of water, 800 to 1,000 feet high, like instantly melted that, and then it just flooded down from Canada, North America to like Wyoming and Utah, and you can see like the Cooley Dam and like the not the Cooley Dam, but the Cooley, the Grand Cooley Dam, I guess. Yeah, we'll just call it that. The Columbia Basin and the Missoula Ice Dam in Missoula, Montana area, and you can see all these big like canyons that were just ripped and torn out and made from like small little gradual valleys to big open like cliffs and these basalt rocks. The basalt rocks come from volcanoes. These boulders were getting stuck inside these um, like big old iceberg chunks that were part of the melt, and they were getting embedded as they were bouncing up against these walls, and as they were smashing these big chunks of like ice, like the size of skyscrapers, were slamming up against these walls. They were ripping out chunks of um, like basalt boulders, kind of like if you would take a ice ball or a snowball and throw it at like a pile of like loose pebbles. Those loose pebbles would get stuck in that snowball. Same concept, but at a grand scale. So it was just ripping these chunks of rocks out and bringing them southward, and then right at the end of the the um, the scablands, you can see that these big old boulders that are from up north are like in the southern, well, a little bit south, and it's not very, I guess, not indigenous, but prominent in the area. It's not from that area, so it shows that that happened in like a quick, rapid succession, where all these flood theories and these flood stories from ancient people talking about how a flood just came like that and wiped people out. Um, that changed the whole like global coastlines. It changed everything. So if those big rocks and chunks like that were getting brought up, and then like the major impact wasn't so much on the eastern hemisphere, uh, northeastern hemisphere, it was more like the northwestern hemisphere, the Americas, that had the most of it, and Greenland. What if there's a smaller ice melt where it brought up smaller, looser, like stuff to infill those enclosures? And maybe those enclosures, from theory one of mine, weren't refinements. Maybe there were different things, different calculations for the skies, different calculations for the seasons, planting, growing, whatever. So each pit or each enclosure for theory two is now not a refinement in theory two of mine, or hypothesis two of mine. Each enclosure tracked different things, like the 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 Mayas and the Incas and the Aztecs had multiple calendars that tracked multiple different things and multiple different events, like one for gods, one specifically, like one was a reed, which was the 52-year cycle of gods and enlightenment and the return of Viracocha and Quetzalcoatl and so on and so forth. So maybe just like how those clocks worked in with one another not in tandem, but they were intermeshed like gears. They were linked together, and they were all separate, but they all in that South American belief system and calendrical intercalation between those two. I mean, those, I think they had three in South America. Same concept. Right now we have three or four enclosures in Gobekli Tepe that are open, but they all have different amounts of um, pillars. Just kind of like the different calendars of like the Aztecs and the Mayas have different aspects and different cycles. I think that's what that is. So from those two theories, that's what I think happened. Maybe like with the younger dryas impact hypothesis, that infill in Gobekli Tepe wasn't a deliberate thing so much. It was an infill from a cataclysm, from a comet impact, and rapid ice melt from from the polar ice caps that were huge at the time, and brought it to the ice age. Now, those are just some theories now, um, of how it got infilled, deliberately infilled by the ancient people. Infilled means like just buried. Why would they rebury something of intricate thing of design for a purpose and build a new one every time? It seems like an exhaustive measure, an exhaustive type of ritualistic behavior to be doing something so strenuous for something so glorious and monumental to them. It seems like a backtrack and like, let's dig this huge pit, erect these like huge but like concrete pillars. No, not concrete, but stone pillars that were almost perfectly rectangles, like monoliths. Yeah, monoliths. Kind of like, that little monolith thing that you see in like the 2001 A Space Odyssey movie. It was like those, but they had like carvings and petroglyphs and stuff like that on them. And they were all unique to each one. They didn't re-mimic them. So that's what takes me away from my first theory that they were refinements or recalculations of the sky, because they're different um, carvings on each of them. They have similar things, like pretty much all of them have serpents, or a serpent, or a bird, or a monkey, or something kind of like that. Where, but but now we're going back to the Garden of Eden, and we're stepping away from the geology thing. So the Garden of Eden had all the animals and all the plant life, and that's exactly what you see at Gobekli Tepe's um, edifices and carvings and stuff like that. Is life. You see trees, you see um, animals, you see anthropomorphic beings, kind of like how gods and stuff like that and other religions were portrayed and represented. And this is all, and it all predates those things. Like, it's like there was a time right where hunting and gathering ended, and that was Gobekli Tepe. When Gobekli Tepe was built, hunting and gathering immediately ended. Um, that was the point from the dawn of man, so to say. Gobekli Tepe is the earliest evidence of, like, the earliest evidence of uh, collecting and gathering and maintaining livestock, and then agriculture, like crops, where they didn't go out and gather berries and gather fruits and gather vegetables in the wild and bring them back to the tribe, or go out and hunt like a wild mammoth or whatever they're hunting, or a saber tooth or whatever they were hunting. I said, whatever they're hunting, they didn't do that anymore. They're like, well, now we have these bison like things, these cattle, and we have these bird like things like chickens or whatever, and we're going to corral them in a fenced off area, and we're going to make them reproduce and make more and feed the whole community, and we're going to plant these seeds. Like, what? So it's like, it was like a sanctuary, an oasis almost of knowledge right there, like the dawn of humanity, of modern humanity as we know it, how we think in a civilized cultural manner, with laws and systems and streets and buildings and homes and temples and judiciary, or judicial systems, marriage and divorce decrees and stuff like that. Like that. So go, and then you have it where it's like nestled right in between the two of the four rivers of Eden. So it was kind of like, maybe that's the gateway. The Eden um, comes from the Sumerian word Eden. E means house, and den, or din, means gods or divine or righteous ones or lofty ones. We don't really know how to translate din, but it was the god, so to say. We don't know exactly what din translates to, what it meant, whether it meant God, whether it meant Lord, whether it meant righteous or lofty or flying. It just meant something that was better and bigger than human beings. They never outright, for what we know, they never outright actually called their gods gods. Like, God is a relatively recent terminology that humans have used to differentiate between a powerful non-metaphysical being to us. I guess that's the best way to say it. So early humans did not call their gods gods. They were called something else. But din, so house of the gods, or house of the lofty ones, house of the righteous ones, however that din translates, that's what Eden means. Eden means house of the gods, we'll say that, or house of the righteous ones. So if you have the house of the righteous ones, and that was the cradle or the gateway of civilization, and you have that in myths and stuff like that, that Eden in between four rivers, and all religions, not all religions, but all Mesopotamian, Near Eastern area, Asia Minor, India, they have the four rivers, the Pison, the Gizon, Euphrates, and the Tigris. Um, so is Gobekli Tepe, in your guys' opinions, is Gobekli Tepe Eden? Was it the gateway of Eden? Was it the gateway of heaven, the gateway of paradise? We can also see that um, around that area, like barley, millet, rye, wheat, stuff like that, started to become the olive trees and stuff like that. That was all started being cultivated in northern Mesopotamia, or like the ancient Near East, Asia Minor area, where Turkey comes from. So at modern day agriculture that we know of, like wheats and grains and cereals, flax, millet, rye, barley, like I've all mentioned before, and all like basic fruits and vegetables and like tree cultivation, all started in that area of Turkey, Syria today. Um, so that furthers the theory of Gobekli Tepe being Eden. Um, Humans were banished out of it um, in fables and legends and myths. So there could have been like type of an abandonment thing where like Gobekli Tepe was like, you're done, like get the hell out of here, humans. Like, and then over time, that infill that Klaus Schmidt talks about um, could happen with a flood, like 1,000 or 2 years later, because Gobekli Tepe was around for at least a couple thousand years, which would fit into the whole Adam and Eve progressing to Noah, and there's other parallels to Noah and Adam, and we'll get into that in another video. But so I don't want to get too much into my own thoughts, because I want you guys to. Oh, excuse me, I burped. I was waiting for that. I want you guys to kind of chew on the fat a little bit and think about the possibility of this Gobekli Tepe being Eden. And maybe if you could get some radar, LiDAR, not so much LiDAR, but some satellite detection where we can see where old riverbeds might have birthed or emerged from, and where they intersected, just like the myths say, where those four rivers intersected. So if I believe that we can see maybe two more rivers that the Bible and other religious texts talk about in their myths and fables, if we use certain type of satellite imaging and penetration from above that we can't see with the naked eye, that's under sedimentary things where we have different densities that and different types of rock beds and sedimentary layers and erosion processes that would indicate those two extra rivers. So until we have that proof, we don't know where those two rivers are, but there could be a good sign, good indication that Gobekli Tepe is Eden. All right, with all that being said, I don't know if this is part 2 or a piggyback or more knowledge than what I gave earlier. I'd like to hear your guys' thoughts on the Eden theory, the infill theory, the younger dryas impact hypothesis, all that. I'd like to hear your guys' inputs and theories on how this all ties together with biblical, historical recordings and ancient recordings and tablets and rolls of paper and papyrus and all sorts of stuff. So, thoughts. Give me your thoughts. Love you guys. Talk at you later.